started, a lot of the investigation has already begun. They've already begun looking at your company, and there's a reason that they're coming in. It's not a lottery or anything. There's actually a reason they're coming in to look at your company. Before they even come in, they've had copies of all your roadsides, your driver vehicle examination reports. And what they're looking at those, besides the dates and the times, they're looking at the commodities you've carried. For example, if you haul batteries, which is we come across a lot, and you have 750,000 on your MCS 90, that's going to be an automatic violation. So this is why they're looking over your roadsides, because they can pick up a lot of information other than just your violations. They've also looked at all your federally recordable accidents. They'll know which ones you had a citation on. So in other words, if you had a citation and you had an accident that required drug testing, they'll know about this when they walked in, and one of the things they'll ask for, of course, is the post-accident drug test for that driver in that accident. Things that can drive an audit, of course, your CSA scores. If you're elevated scores, you can expect to be audited. If complaints from previous drivers, brokers, or the public, this generates a lot of audits that generally they won't tell us why they're coming in, but at some point in the investigation we may discover it's a complaint. I was at one last week where the investigation was started because a previous driver was thought he owed money by the company. So he called the FMCSA and basically told them about all the times he was over hours and the company looked the other way, and some other issues with inside the company. So this is one of the things that can trigger an audit. Also, a motorist complaint. Somebody's taking your DOT number of the truck that they think is speeding or tailgating and refers it to the FMCSA. Most of these come back as frivolous complaints. There's no reason for them to come in and audit you, but sometimes they don't, depending on who's making the complaint. They're going to look at all your insurance coverages. Another thing that they're going to do when they walk in the door, they will have already taken the owner of the company's name and run it through the database to see if they can find any previous companies that they either owned or worked for. An example would be if you were a safety director at a company and you were listed as a safety director, and that was in somebody's review. When they come in to do your company, they're going to find out you were affiliated with that company. And it's one of the questions that they'll ask during the initial interview. And every compliance review starts with them sending you a list of documents that they want you to prepare before the audit. Typically, this will include a list of all your drivers and all your vehicles, how many drivers you have, your yearly income. So it'll give the investigator we walk through a little bit of data, and he's going to check all that too. He's going to corroborate all that information you've given him. So if they start out the interview by asking you, have you ever worked for another company, or did you ever previously have a different DOT number, they're going to know if you did. So at that point, it's very fine to say, yes, we do, or yes, we do have another DOT number. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, there's some very good reasons to have more than one. But what you don't want to do is mislead them and tell them you don't have another DOT or you never had another company, and then they discover it. This doesn't go well for the rest of the review. And there's certainly nothing wrong with having two DOT numbers. Documentation that they're going to ask for and that you have to provide. All record of duty status for the previous 6 months and supporting documents. What this means is every log for every driver has to be available for review for the last 6 months. Now, typically what they will do when they come in, they'll look at some things. They'll pick any red flag driver by policy and audit his logs. So they might say, driver A, give me the month of January for that 30-day period. And then they'll say, driver B, give me February for his 30-day period. The amount of logs they audit will depend on the size of your company. There's a program the federal government uses to determine how many to be audited. So if you have, say, 140 drivers, your sample size for log audits would be 11. So they would ask for 11 drivers, and they would tell you what 11 drivers that they want to audit and what 30-day time period. Now, they don't pick these guys out at random. They're going to pick guys that had issues on the roadside inspections, definitely anybody that had a false log. They will also take the guys that use the most fuel or had the most cycles. They're entitled to your fuel receipts. And the reason they pick the guys that use the most fuel is because they have the most miles. And therefore, they probably have a better chance of maybe having problems with their hours of service. If you don't know what red flag drivers are, you should just go on the FMCSA website, type in red flag drivers, and it'll give you the list of the violations. A red flag driver is automatically looked at no matter what. And if he had this red flag violation before he came to your company, it follows the driver. So even if he didn't commit any one of these offenses with you, if he did it with another company before he came to work with you, he's still a red flag driver, and his file would still be audited. They'll ask for the load confirmations, bill of ladings, toll receipts. Even if you have owner-operators and they pay their own tolls, the regulations say that you as the motor carrier need to keep those receipts. Any GPS data. If you have trucks parked at a location, before the investigator comes into your location, usually they'll drive around the lot and they'll look for GPS antennas. And if they see the GPS antennas, they'll ask you for the GPS data. And if you say you don't have it and they've already seen the antenna, this could be an issue. They're also looking for the toll transponders. And if they see the transponder and they ask for the toll receipts and we say we don't have them, they'll ask us why we have the transponder in the truck. So again, a lot of this happens before they even walk in the door. They're also entitled to ask for settlements for the drivers. They'll ask for the fuel purchases for all the trucks. Now, this is where they may ask for the password for the system. I'm not a big fan of that. If they ask for specific fuel receipts, we'll provide it. If they want us to log in and watch it, we'll do that. But I'm not likely to just give them the password for the fuel reports. But we do have to produce them. They'll also ask for your IFTA mileage for the last 4 quarters. And this is another thing that your 150 should be up to date. In other words, if you have mileage on there that's incorrect, it should be corrected to your last 4 IFTAs. They'll use that mileage to calculate your accident rate, and it shouldn't be more or less than you actually can substantiate. So this is why they'll ask for your last 4 quarters of IFTA. Also, if your address on your 150 is incorrect, you need to change that. In other words, if you go on Safer and that address isn't your principal place of business, you'll want to change that. We do see a lot of companies that list their house as their principal place of business, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that if you're operating out of your house. But if you're not, you really need to change that, because if you're involved in any litigation, what you've done is listed your house as a company asset. This is where you're doing business out of. So again, our suggestion is if you don't have to have the address as your house, don't do it. They'll ask for your vehicle maintenance records. And this is a lot of times where we just have the list of the vehicles. Even if they're all owner-operators, you have to have a copy of the maintenance schedule. You have to have a copy of all the DVIRs. You have to have a copy of all the repairs. Now, what they'll do is they'll take the roadside repairs and say one of your drivers had a air leak, and they know the date and the time of this air leak. So what they'll do is ask you for proof of repairs. Well, you have to have that. Even though you don't own the truck or an owner-operator has the truck, you're responsible for maintaining those repair records as long as they're operating under your DOT number. And they can go back 365 days on asking for these receipts. DVIRs, or driver vehicle inspection reports, they'll ask for the previous 90 days. This is also one of the biggest problems that we find, and it's one of the biggest misunderstandings on how things work. The DVIR is done at the end of the day, not at the beginning of the day. There's actually no requirement for a written pre-trip. There is a requirement you do a pre-trip, but there's not a requirement for a written pre-trip. And also one of the things they'll look at is when the driver started his day on his hours of service, did he log a pre-trip? And this becomes problematic a couple of different ways. One is that there's no time listed as a pre-trip. So now the investigator will say, well, either you didn't do a pre-trip, which is required by law, or you have a false log because you didn't record the pre-trip. And the question we get most often is, well, how much time should the driver log for a pre-trip? If the driver drives the same truck and trailer every day, I think I can defend 12 minutes very, very well. 15 is even better. What I can't make an argument for, and nobody really can, is that your driver pre-tripped a tractor or a trailer in 5 minutes. This is going to be extremely problematic, and more so if your driver is involved in an accident. So again, there's no requirement for a written pre-trip, but your driver has to perform one, and he has to reflect this on his hours of service or on his log. The DVIR is only required to be filled out if there's a problem with the vehicle or something is broke on the vehicle, some vehicle issue. Now, if I go to Walmart and I have a light out and I fix the light, technically I should do a DVIR, but there's no way anybody could ever trace that if I just went to Walmart and did it. However, every driver vehicle examination report or roadside inspection report that you have, remember, he has all of these when he comes in, or she, to do your audit. So what they'll do is they'll look at a driver that had a air leak on February 2nd. And then they'll ask you for the DVIR for February 2nd. If that DVIR did not list that air leak, it's a false DVIR. If you don't have the DVIR for that day, it's a missing DVIR. Now, they can only go back 90 days on checking these. So it's very important that you make sure that all your DVIRs match your roadside inspections. If there's something on there, list vehicle 1 or 2, tractor or trailer, that defect must be listed on the DVIR. And again, the DVIR is filled out at the end of the day, not the beginning of the day. So some of the questions they'll start asking you when they start asking about the hours of service, they'll ask you for who does the editing rights of your hours of service. When you switch to ELDs, you'll have to have the system set up as it appears on a government ID, anybody who has editing rights. And it's not uncommon for them to ask who does the editing and then call your ELD or AORVD provider and start asking them questions about your account. This is almost standard procedure now in every audit. They'll compare this against the vehicle list, the login list. The special driving categories are getting a lot of attention now. Personal conveyance. It's something that everybody's going to need to use to remain competitive, and there are a lot of good uses for it. Recently, they've allowed us some leeway with using this. If your driver's at a shipper or a receiver and he runs out of hours, he can actually use personal conveyance, loaded or unloaded, to go to the truck stop or the first place of rest. What he can't do is bypass 5 or 6 to advance the load. So there's some things that they're going to look at when they look at personal conveyance. And the easiest way to manage this is to educate your drivers and your dispatchers on how the correct use of this. But it is something we're going to need to really look at. And it's also one of the things that they will look at pretty heavily in a review. Now, our number one defense on justifying the personal conveyance is going to be the notes or the annotations that you put in. If the driver just puts personal conveyance and lists nothing else, we're probably going to get questions on it, and we may even get it denied as an acceptable use. What we really need the drivers to do is to put in the notations of what happened. In other words, as shipper ran out of hours, went for rest and food. Going to get food. Wherever you can stop, he's driving somewhere to get food. He doesn't need to drop the trailer. He doesn't need to be unloaded. But what he has to do is list that. So again, personal conveyance could be a whole webinar onto itself. But to remain competitive, we're going to have to really use this and use it correctly. The same goes for the adverse driving conditions. The regulations do allow us to drive up to 2 extra hours depending on certain conditions. And again, you need to use this properly. If you're stuck, say your driver is driving at night and they're putting a beam over the highway and he stopped for 45 minutes, he can use this as adverse driving conditions. But now if he was only stopped for 45 minutes, he doesn't get 2 hours just because he was stopped for 45. And also, it has to be something that you could have made absent that adverse driving condition. And this also covers highways covered with snow. If your speed is reduced because of the snow, you're entitled to this exemption. But again, you have to document it. If we just say we used it, we have to tell them why, where was this accident, where was this highway, what was the conditions. We really have to document that. The AORBD is being used, of course, to make sure it's compliant with the government. And one of the biggest things that we're going to see is your AORBD has your mileage recording on it, your odometer. And the big thing they're looking for now is odometer jumps. So in other words, we have a driver's beginning and ending mileage, but it doesn't correlate into their total driving miles. In other words, the driver goes 500 miles, but then we have a missing 100 on the odometer. They call it an odometer jump. And this is a red flag that there's either a falsification or something going on. Now, if we have a communication error or we have some kind of mechanical error, you have to document it. We can't just say, well, we didn't get a signal that day, or the AORBD was malfunctioning. You have to document what happened, and then we have at least something we can argue on. But if we don't do that, it's just going to hurt us very badly on the review. So the personal conveyance is going to get looked at pretty heavily, and definitely any odometer jumps. Probably the worst thing we can do is turn it off and turn it back on, because remember, it's operating under a GPS signal. So we'll have a location where we turned it off in Dallas, Texas, and miraculously the next time we have a reading, it's in Houston. Well, they're going to catch this right away because we have this odometer jump. So again, and we also have this location jump. So even though it's not an ELD, it's still recording what we do to a good extent. And these things will be looked at during the review. Some of the things that we'll discover using this are false logs. And I think we all know what that is. But again, using these odometer jumps, if we can't explain where this extra location came from and why it wasn't logged, that will be cited as a false log. If the driver turns off the ELD and it magically appears in another city, this is going to be a false log. We have no way of saying how that happened. Missing documentation is a violation that will be discovered. And in other words, they ask us for a fuel receipt that we don't have that we should have. Or if they ask us for a fuel receipt that doesn't match the time of the driver and the location of the driver. The vehicle maintenance and the DVIRs and the roadsides will all be used. Now, whenever you look at a roadside inspection, it has the time, date, and location. They can use that against your hours of service records because they know exactly where your truck was at this date, at this time, and then use that to correlate any driving activities with the truck. And they can falsify your log based on that. They can also get you for the 14-hour violations, the 11-hour driving violations, the 70-hour weekly violations. Now, during the audit, we need to be at a critical rate. So in other words, if you remember, I talked about sample sizes. So say they're sampling 10 drivers at 30 days each, that's 300 logs. If we had 29 logs that were false, that wouldn't affect our safety rating. It has to be at 10%. So when they audit your logs, one false log isn't going to downgrade you to a conditional carrier. Your false logs or other hours violations have to be at what we call a critical rate, or 10%. And then having said that, not all violations are counted towards your score. If it's a nominal violation, that is, the violation is less than 1 hour or 50 miles, it's scored as a nominal violation. Now, it's still a violation. You can still be fined for it, but it can't be used to calculate your false log rate or your log failure rate. Once they're doing all this, and 395 are hours of service, if we fail that part of the review and everything else is okay, we're still a conditional carrier. 395 or hours of service is one of the few categories that you can fail on itself and be automatically downgraded. Other things we're going to look at, of course, are accident rate. They'll calculate your recordable accidents for the last year, and if that number comes out greater than 1.5 per million miles traveled, you'll fail the accident rate. This is why it's really important to have the IFTA mileage correct. If you have drivers or owner-operators that do their own IFTA, you are entitled to take those mileage. This is also why we can't inflate the mileage, why they would ask us for proof of it, because we wouldn't want to say we go 20 million miles just to get our accident rate down. They're going to ask us for those IFTAs to verify that. So they're going to look at our accident rate. Unfortunately, all accidents are calculated. If we ask for preventability on the review, if it's going to affect our safety rating, we have a little bit of leeway. As most people know now, we can do a data queue and get an accident that we think wasn't our fault removed. We can do the same thing on a compliance review, but we have a little more criteria that we can use to get that declared non-preventable. So it is something we need to do during the review. Another thing that they'll do is it's not unusual for them to ask for your loss runs. And what they're doing on your loss runs is trying to find an accident that wasn't federally recordable, but you recorded to your insurance company. And this is a tool that they're entitled to use as well. The vehicle factor, we talked about the DVIRs and how difficult those can be, and the vehicle maintenance records. What everybody needs to have is a schedule. And now it can be anything you want, but it's one of the things they cite carriers for almost every time for not having a maintenance schedule. You are required to have one. It could be anything you want, but you do have to have some type of schedule. Then we're going to go into the driver qualification files. And if you're running PSP, you need to match that against the driver application. Everybody needs a driver application, but what we don't do sometimes is you list previous employers, and then we get the PSP. Well, on the PSP, we see a carrier he didn't list as a previous employer. This becomes very, very problematic, because now we know it's a false app because he didn't list this company. There's nothing wrong with the driver going back and submitting a corrected app. We can absolutely do that, but we don't want to wait till the audit to do that. Or worse yet, if you're in a lawsuit and we have to produce these documents and it turns out that we know the application was false, even if we're doing everything else right, this could potentially be a problem for us. They'll also check the medical examiner certificate, making sure that it's dated correctly, that the driver wasn't dispatched with an expired card. They'll also check the annual review of driving records. This is also a big problem for a lot of carriers. Once a year, you're required to check your driving record, your MVR, and you have to have the driver himself or herself physically fill out the form and sign it and date it. If they have no tickets or no violations, they have to write none, but they have to do this by their own hand. Then you, as the motor carrier, have to sign it that you reviewed it, and you also have to attach a copy of the MVR. Now, it can be one from the state, or it can be one from a service that you've employed to provide these MVRs. So these are the things that we're looking at with the driver qualification file, and of course the pre-employment drug test. They'll look at that to make sure the date of the pre-employment drug test, the negative on file, was before the first dispatch. So they will always match this up. When they look at the applications, they'll also look, did you contact the previous employer? A lot of times the previous employer won't get back to us, so all you have to do is document, LM, left message, whatever you did. Just document what that you did try to get a hold of this employer. If you don't do that and you don't check the background of your driver, that's going to be a violation on the review. Another thing that they're going to check for when they're looking at the driver qualification file is, do you have any training? This isn't required by the FMCSA, but it is also something that can really protect you in case of an accident. Any training documents, and it also is a demonstration to the FMCSA that you have safety management controls. The one policy you do have to have is a drug and alcohol policy, and it has to have some very specific elements in that policy. If you don't have one or you're not sure of one, I would suggest talking to somebody and making sure that your policy is in compliance. They're going to also ask for your drug testing results and your polls. If you're using somebody like MedStop or TransLab, this is pretty easy. You just call MedStop and they'll give you this information. If you're using a smaller or less known company, then you may want to just give them a call from time to time to make sure you're compliant with your testing requirements. They'll also ask for the supervisor reasonable suspicion training. Every company has to have at least one person in the company that has this training. And it's 1 hour of the effects of drugs and 1 hour of the effects of alcohol. It's available commercially from a lot of different companies. Some companies charge a lot of money for this online training. I wouldn't pay any more than, say, $50 because a lot of people will offer it for under that. But at least one person in your company needs to have that certification. So the outcome, when they're all done with the rating, they'll have what they call a closeout. And the safety investigator will meet with you and go over the results of the audit. And depending on what they've discovered, it can be a non-rated review where they've looked at everything and they're just basically saying we have no big discoveries, we have no huge fines, and we're not going to upgrade your safety rating if you're a non-rated carrier now, or if you're a satisfactory, we're not going to upgrade your rating. Or I'm sorry, if you're a conditional, we're not going to upgrade you. If it's a full compliance review, we can be satisfactory, conditional, or unsatisfactory. Satisfactory means we didn't fail any of the factors. Conditional means we failed, say, hours of service. Alone would make us a conditional carrier. Or if we had some vehicle issues on top of some other issues, we'll be a conditional carrier. Now, if we have hours of service issues and, say, a high crash rate, we could be an unsatisfactory carrier. If we're a conditional carrier, we can still operate just like we always have. But what could happen is we might not have access to the same freight and the same brokers as we did before. And if we have an upcoming renewal on our insurance, this will certainly affect our rates and possibly the companies that would write our insurance. If we're unsatisfactory now, we have a lot of problems. If you're a non-hazmat carrier and you're unsatisfactory, you have 60 days to be upgraded or you'll have to cease operations. What that means, within that 60 days, you have to petition and be approved for a plan to upgrade, a conditional action plan, or a safety management plan. Now, we have 15 days from the date of the rating to get that submitted to be guaranteed to ruled on. So, in other words, we have 60 days, but we only have 15 days to submit this plan to address whatever deficiencies they found to get ruled on. Now, it doesn't mean they're not going to approve it, but it means we have a good chance to get that done before you're out of business. So if you have an unsatisfactory rating, it's something you need to work on immediately. And of course, the best way to avoid any of these is to have somebody look at what you're doing before they come in the door. The worst case scenario is the imminent hazard. This means they've discovered something so bad that you're basically going to be shut down that day. Now, this is not an easy thing for them to do. It requires going in front of a judge and some other things, but it is possible in the most extreme cases. So one of the things we're going to do is, if we have a less than satisfactory rating, is they're going to identify in the Part B violations any violations we received. There's also going to be a fine involved. One of the things they asked for before they started the review was your yearly revenue as a carrier. Now, what I suggest is you get the front page of your W-2, your tax return, and black out all information except for the gross. They're not entitled to know how much profit you made, but they are entitled to know the gross revenue. And the reason for this is, at the end of the review, if you have any fines, they can't fine you more than you could pay. So that fine is based on your income. This is why we have to produce it. So any fines you should have will be based on the amount of income that you have. This can have a lot of different things going on depending on how big our fine is. And there are some options you have after the fines. And if anybody wants to contact us, we could talk about those on another time. Of course, if you're a conditional carrier, the insurance ramifications on this are huge. You'll probably pay more in premium. If you're working with an A-rated carrier, there's a really good chance they may not write you, and certainly not write you under the same terms and conditions as they did previously. We have some broker implications, and this varies all over the place. It could be where the broker's just not going to ship on a conditional carrier, or the shipper's not going to ship on a conditional carrier, or it could be that you'll get a letter saying if you don't improve in 1 or 2 years that they're not going to use you anymore. So it's really all over the place with how that will affect you. The shipper implications, of course, is a lot of shippers have it written into their agreements with the brokers that they won't ship on a conditional carrier. And I think everybody knows what double brokering is, so I'll just give you an example of how bad it can go. If we have a shipper that tenders freight to a satisfactory carrier, and that carrier turns around and gives that freight to a conditional carrier, and now there's an accident, we have huge implications for everybody involved. And it gets very complicated very quick. So it's one of the things to keep in mind on. And, well, that's about what I have right now. So I think we're going to open it up for questions.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Jeff very much for the presentation today. I'm going to put up on the screen here, this is Jeff's bio, but I also have the Center for Transportation Safety Excellence information here. Write it down, take a look at the website. I'm going to move to the next slide here. Obviously, if anyone wants to get in touch with Jeff, you can email or call any one of the people at I'm in Motion. We'll get you the right information as well. Before we go into Q&A, and again, type your questions into the box here, and then Jeff and I can address each of them. But I just want to do the next one. We're going to be having an additional webinar here at the end of next month or the end of May. And basically, this is going to be around how to approach your AOBRD to ELD transition. The topics here is, we all know that the ELD mandate is going to be enforced in December of this year. So, our goal here at I'm in Motion is to make sure that all of you are ready for that. So that will be a webinar at the end of the end of May. After that, we are actually going to have a in-person event. It will be at the end of July, and it's going to be centered around transitioning from AOBRD to ELD. So hopefully, at the end of next month, we can get a plan, and then at the end of July, we're going to be talking about, okay, let's enforce that plan. How does I'm in Motion help you guys make that plan happen? Additionally, I don't know if anyone has heard some rumbling. I know we have talked to certain people. We have been working extremely hard. We took everyone's feedback, and we are in the process right now of developing a brand new platform. It's going to have a lot of additional functionality, and at the core of it, it's really getting your data in less clicks. So we're very excited about that. There'll be more information to come at the end of July. Last thing here, right? For all of you guys attending today's webinar, we're going to give you guys a $250 bill credit for anyone who buys some new services in the next 60 days. We're really trying to push, obviously, safety. We have a lot of different solutions that can help you, achieve those goals. So with that being said, I'm going to open up, I'm going to end the presentation here, and I'm going to get into the Q&A session here so that we can We have one question thus far. Unassigned hours of service and all the problems that can come along. That's a two-way street, and there need to be a lot of OPET issues there. Can you talk about that?
Sure. The unassigned mileage, again, they're looking at this pretty heavily. I would say if you have mechanics that are saying that they drove the truck, you need to document that. The easiest way, of course, is to make the mechanic, if they're an in-house mechanic, a driver on the system for test driving. What we've seen so far, we had one that comes to mind. It was a test drive of 265 miles. Well, of course, this was a bit problematic trying to explain why we had a test drive of 265 miles. Probably what's going to happen with some carriers that slip seat. This is where we're going to run into a big issue. So we have an over-the-road driver that drives the truck, comes back on Wednesday night. A local driver takes that truck, and he's totally exempt from the ELD requirements, but he takes the truck the next day to deliver locally. Well, those mileages are going to be recorded, that movements will be recorded, but the driver that came back Wednesday isn't going to accept those miles, quite rightfully, because they weren't his. But we're going to have a hard time documenting that this was a local driver that drove those miles. So now if it's a local driver, what I would say, even if he's exempt from the requirements, set him up with an account and have him log in. It's going to make it much easier than trying to explain why we have this discrepancy in our unassigned miles.
Awesome. Okay, we got a few more. Next question is, what would be accurate procedure to document ELD malfunctions?
Great question. What we have to do, this is why they have the requirement that we need 8 days of logs in the truck, blank logs. The regulations state that you have to the driver has to notify the carrier immediately. So we have 8 days to get the ELD or AORBD repaired. So what we need to do is make a notation on the hours of service of what the malfunction was. In other words, consecutive issue, something. And then we're going to be fine on the paper logs for those 8 days. But what we have to do is document everything. If we just say it broke, that doesn't really help us. So what we need to do is say what happened, what day it happened, and of course, within 8 days, it's incumbent on us as the motor carrier to get it repaired. But it's just like everything involving the electronic logging, we're really going to have to document why we did whatever we did. That's going to help us tremendously.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. So, I mean, a lot of people that are running AOBRD haven't experienced, the ELD functionality as well. So I'll just kind of add to that, to what Jeff just said. So ELD malfunctions are all going to be recorded not only at the mobile level, but also at the admin level in the portal. It is a requirement of the FMCSA. If you search the knowledge base that we provide to you guys, you'll be able to see a document which dictates exactly what malfunction and data diagnostics, right? Because one thing that's going to change from AOBRD to ELD is data diagnostics will also be recorded. So all of that information will be recorded as well. When you're at a roadside inspection, it'll be detailed out as an event there. So that's just some additional information. Another question that we had come in is, any idea on the proposed changes from the FMCSA that are coming out?
Oh, absolutely. And again, another great question. What they're looking at now is elimination of the 30-minute break rule, and I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. Another thing they're looking at is going back to the previous hours of service that allowed you to split up the time. In other words, if you worked for 5 hours and you were a shipper and the sleeper for 4 hours, that 4 hours wouldn't count against your clock. So we're looking at that. Those are probably the two biggest issues that we're looking at now. And they're also looking at possibly, and I say this possibly, extending our driving time a little bit. So for years we've been saying give them the rules and they'll change them if everybody follows them. So we're getting a little closer to that now with the ELD, that they're going to have to make some adjustments. I think these will be the first two elimination of the 30-minute break rule and allowing us to split up our driving time.
I don't see any more questions here in the queue. Hold on, we got one more that just came through. Random drug testing must be recorded as on duty, not driving. That's also a point of interest for the investigator. Meaning that's a question. Is that a...
Yes, yeah, it can be. I've never seen it where they've cited a carrier for it. In other words, they match up the time you went for the random drug test and say it was on duty. I haven't seen it. Potentially it could be. Legally it should be. If it was the direction of the motor carrier, he does have to log it as on duty. Now you as the motor carrier, you get to assign when they go for the random. So in other words, you wouldn't call a guy on his 34-hour reset and have him go for a random drug test because this would potentially affect his 34-hour reset. The same would be on his 10-hour break. You wouldn't want to send him 3 hours into his 10-hour break because now legally that is going to be on duty, not driving, and that would interrupt his break. So again, you as the motor carrier have a lot of leeway of when you send them for these randoms. So just whatever you do, just kind of make sure it doesn't interfere with the workflow.
Perfect. Thanks, Joe. I don't see any more questions here. We're at about 1:52 Central Time. We still have some time. Hold on, I think a couple more may have just come through. Yeah, we got a couple more here. Okay. In regards to supervisor D/A training, is this annually or a one-time deal?
It's a one-time deal, and it doesn't even need to be specific to the motor carrier. So if you had this training for a company you worked at previously and you went to a new company as a safety director or just worked for the company and had that training, it is portable. In other words, it can come with you and there's no expiration on it.
Another question. One of my colleagues has a question in regards to previous employment verification. Is it mandatory to also check non-trucking jobs listed on an app?
No, you're only required to check the anything that has safety sensitive function. In other words, were they under the DOT rules. Now they have to list them, but you only have to check the ones that were safety sensitive function.
Gotcha. Okay. A couple more questions are coming in. This is great. Keep them coming. What is the best way a driver can distinguish between the difference between AOBRD and ELD to an officer at a roadside? I can answer that. As soon as you enter into the roadside inspection mode, it should clearly say on top of the page there what mode they are operating in. So if they're in AOBRD, it's going to say AOBRD 395.15, and if they're operating in ELD, it'll say ELD 395.20. Yep, Jeff wants to expand. Here he goes.
Yeah, that's a great question because we've done, so far, I couldn't even count the number of data queue challenges we've done on this. When operating under the AORBD mode, the officer cites them for not being able to transmit the data. And what they're doing is they're confusing ELDs with AORBDs. So it's really not just the drivers. We're seeing a huge lack of training on the enforcement personnel as well.
Okay. Actually, there I was going to ask an additional follow-up, but one just came in. We'll take them as they come. So if there is a malfunction and driver is using a paper log, when he gets pulled over for a roadside inspection, how much time does he have to get current log ready?
It depends when he's going to say it malfunctioned. The regulations say it has to be current with the last duty change. So if he's going to say it happened last night and I haven't logged on duty, that's going to be a violation if he's on paper. If he says I was driving and right before I got to the scales it quit working, I think there's some leeway with that. So the regulation says that if it quits working, that you have to automatically switch to paper and reconstruct the previous hours of service.
Another question here, which actually I'm going to expand upon this. So what happens when the officer tells them, a driver, that they should be running an ELD? So I'm going to expand upon this and then I'll let Jeff kind of jump in here as well. So one of the questions that I actually had written down is, you know, if a driver is put out of service for operating in an AOBRD regulation mode, obviously they can data queue that, Jeff, but what can a driver do at a roadside inspection? Because we're seeing this, and there's really no rhyme or reason, so I'm going to let Jeff kind of take this from here.
And again, it all depends on where he's at and the temperament of the officer. I've actually talked to officers on roadsides and explained to them, the driver's called, they're putting me out of service for 10 hours because I don't have an ELD, but I have an AORBD. I would have the driver call you right away, and because he's right there with the officer. Depending on the officer, and I've been successful at doing this and explaining to the officer, because again, they didn't do the training on this for the enforcement officers as good as they could have. I can data queue it later, but that doesn't help us if our guy is sitting on the side of the road for 10 hours needlessly. So again, the best thing you can do is have your driver call you and speak to the officer and explain to him exactly what system you have, give him as much information as you can, and document all of that, right? Not that it's going to help us a lot, but afterwards we can even lodge a complaint. So again, the first line of defense on that is to talk to the officer or make sure your drivers understand what to tell the officer, right? It doesn't hurt to put a letter in each truck explaining that you're running AORBD and citing the carrier you're using and the phone number for the carrier. That way they could call M2M and say, okay, here's a letter from my company, I'm running AORBD, here's the phone number for M2M, you can call them because they can testify or they can tell you that we're running AORBD mode, it's perfectly legal.
Yeah, and I mean, I've had many conversations with probably a lot of people on this webinar as well, and, you know, my suggestion has always been, you know, just, you know, hopefully that the driver, if he can, and this is just kind of expanding upon what Jeff just said, if he can tell the officer, hey, you know, officer, you know, we've had AOBRDs prior to December of 2017, you know, it's our understanding that we are able to use these until December of 2019. And always, again, I mean, I think we all know and we've seen that, you know, Jeff hit it, the officer's temperament. If he's just in a bad mood, you may not be able to do anything.
And just really quick on that again, if you put it in writing on company letterhead and you put that information in there, that's going to go a long way. Sometimes officers are a little reluctant to believe drivers. That's a joke, and some people are laughing. But having that in writing can make all the difference in the world.
All right, we got a few more questions here. Would daily pre-trip inspection recorder on-duty time 15 minutes per log be sufficient as DVIR if there is no issues with the equipment?
No, the DVIR is done at the end of the day. The pre-trip is done at the beginning of the day. There's no requirement that you have a written pre-trip, but there is a requirement to fill out a DVIR if something is wrong. And remember, the DVIR is done at the end of the day. As far as a 15-minute pre-trip, I like that a lot. I can defend that all day long, that a competent, well-trained driver can inspect his truck in 15 minutes. So I'm perfectly fine with that. But again, the DVIR is probably one of the most misunderstood pieces of paper that we have. It's done at the end of the day, and it's only required if there was something wrong with the vehicle. And the only way that they can correlate that into a fine or a violation for us is if there's a roadside inspection showing a vehicle defect that wasn't listed on that DVIR.
Next question by John, and I think it probably tied into, you know, what happens if the officer tells the driver they should be running an ELD. Would it be beneficial to have cameras in that situation within the vehicle?
Yeah, I mean, it never hurts. But again, the officer's clearly making a mistake. If he's, number one, that the officer has no way of knowing when you install these AORBDs. And so if he's claiming that you were required to have an ELD, he would have to have some evidence that you had an ELD and replaced it with an AORBD, which of course he doesn't. So the recording may help, but again, I think that piece of paper clearly explaining what system you're using and the phone number of the system you're using is going to help you tremendously.
Another question here. Is it required by the FMCSA to have a sticker on one or both sides of the vehicle? I assume meaning, is it an ELD? Is
Well,
it an AOD?
what sticker? And no, there's no requirement for any sticker saying electronic logging. Believe it or not, when they first started selling these, guys were buying them at the truck stops, thinking that it would help them along the scale, even though they didn't have any electronic logging device. So there is no requirement for that. And I know a lot of people include them in with the ELD. It doesn't hurt, but it's not required.
One more question. Can the driver use his personal mobile device, cell phone, to log his hours of service? Or does it have to be, or does the device have to be dedicated to ELD HOS purpose only and must be mounted? So I'll answer the mounted. The mounted is a requirement when you move to ELD. It has to be mounted. It also has to be tied to a power source because there's a malfunction that happens if it is not detect power for 1 hour. You will actually get a malfunction that says revert back to paper logs. The mounting itself, yes, it has to be out of view of the windshield. So I'll let Jeff answer the rest.
And again, the requirements for the ELD and the AORBD are vastly different in this regard. The ELD has to be visible to the driver when driving. The ELD also has to be able to be passed to the investigator outside the truck. There's no such requirement for the AORBD other than providing it to the driver. Now, if it's an ELD, a true ELD running under ELD mode, whatever device is projecting the hours of service also has to be a compliant ELD. So in other words, if we have just a small device hooked to the J-bus of the truck that's recording the hours, if he's doing it on a tablet, the tablet itself, also the operating system, has to be on the website of approved ELDs.
And ours is. I mean, again, when we certified, we certified with our device that's tagged to the ECM as well as the operating system that Jeff kind of just alluded to, so either Android or iOS. Another question. Are you familiar with the E-rods? What system is used in Washington, Oregon State by the DOT? If the answer is yes, can you tell us something more about it?
I can't tell you the very specific system, but I can tell you when they were doing all the training and testing protocols, as far as I can tell, everything was based on OmniTrax. That's what they copied virtually for the requirements. What they're using now, I couldn't tell you. This is going back a couple of years ago when they were first coming up with the technical parameters for what they would require on ELDs.
Thank you, Jeff. There's no more questions in the queue here. I had one more question. If you do happen to get audited and the DOT puts you into conditional rating, how do you get out of a conditional rating?
How you have to get out of a conditional rating is you have to submit a corrective action plan or a safety management plan and get it approved. You have to address the violations that were identified during the review, and you have to offer evidence or some type of corrective action. Typically, the easiest way to do this if you're running an AORBD is to switch to an ELD and make that part of your corrective action. You're going to have to do it in December anyway. I can tell you that a couple years ago, the companies that waited to transition to an AORBD in November had a lot of problems for a while. My advice is you're going to have to do it in December. Talk to your M2M representative and start thinking about really starting a timetable of when you plan on doing this. The sooner the better, but set a timetable for yourself. Don't just try to say, okay, at the last minute, we're going to hope we can get this done and adjust our operations to it. come up with a plan.
Got a few more questions. This is great. Just to be clear, we have to log on duty not driving at least 12 minutes for pre-trip inspection.
Legally, you have to log the pre-trip, but if it's less than 12 minutes, I'm going to have, if you're in an accident and we were defending your company after the accident and saying your driver was a good driver, he did a qualified pre-trip, 12 minutes I'm very comfortable with if the driver drives that truck all the time. Anything less than 12 minutes gets a little harder to defend because the people that are going against you or suing you will have an expert come back and say, well, there's no way you could pre-trip a truck in 9 minutes. And they'd have a pretty good argument. So 12 minutes I'm pretty comfortable with. I like 15, but 12 will work.
Another question that just came in. Sometimes automatic transitions appear on the log. Is it possible to turn those off? So if you're running an AOBRD, there is no speed movement requirement thus far. In ELD, you have a 5 mile per hour speed movement threshold. Any status to driving will happen at 5 miles per hour, and it will be an automatic transition. There is no way to turn those off. I hope that answered the question. Jeff's got some more hands.
Yeah, if I could expound on that a little bit. The investigative directions that the DOT has when doing an audit, if you're running an AORBD mode, is if it's set above 15 miles an hour, that this is going to raise a lot of questions and they're going to look at you a lot heavily. So if you have it set at over 15 miles an hour to default to driving, this could be problematic. If you're in an accident and you have it set at 60, this is going to be very, very problematic for your company.
Another question that just came in. Is printed fuel and maintenance receipts sufficient as supporting docs for DOT audit? It
depends what they're printed from. The receipt you get at the truck stop, like a Flying J, won't have a time stamp on it. This is why they'll ask for your card, your Fleet One, or however you're paying for the fuel, because that report will have a generated timestamp. So in other words, the receipt you actually get at the truck stop won't have the time on it, so it really doesn't help a lot. It gives us the location and the date, but not the time. Now, they're totally within their rights to ask for your Fleet One report, which will have the times on them.
In addition, we have, maintenance that you can capture in the platform as well. There's no more questions as of right now. We've got about 22 minutes left on the webinar. If anyone else wants to chime in here, please feel free.
It doesn't have to be anything.
Yeah, well, okay. We got a few more. Is that 12-minute for pre-trip for tractor and trailer, or the straight truck also? What would be the minimum for straight trucks?
The minimum for straight truck, if the driver drives it all the time, between 8 and 10 minutes. I can make that work. If it's a straight truck and the driver drives that same unit. For a tractor trailer, 12, anything below 12 is going to be problematic. And again, that's the one the driver drives all the time. If it's a truck that he slips seats or drives a different truck every day, then I'm going to need 15. But I can make 12 minutes work.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay. No more questions coming in as of right now. And Jeff just said it's open, so you can ask him whatever you'd like at this point. Additionally, before we end this, I'm going to flash up here real quick. If anyone else is going to ask any questions, I wanted to just put, Jeff and CTSE's contact information here as well. So take a picture of it right now if you could. Feel free to give them a call, shoot them an email, take a look at their website. They're a wealth of knowledge, and they're a very good partner of M2M in Motion as well. Let's see if there's anything else here. Okay, we got one more. What is a good way to file equipment maintenance for a truck and trailer?
There's a lot of electronic programs. Some are fairly expensive. M2M has a system where you can record this electronically. There's certain things that need to be in there. You need to have the tire size, the date the vehicle entered service. If you got rid of it, the date it left your service. The tire size is, believe it or not, a requirement. The serial number, the make and model of the unit, and then an M2M system captures the maintenance records as well. So again, on M2M, you can use all these and transmit that data to your account or to your portal.
Yeah, we can. I mean, and actually, I mean, we're taking we're taking data right off the engine bus. So I mean, we're capturing odometer, we're capturing engine hours, repair receipts. You're able to upload. We're also going to be pushing out a new version. We'll call it V2 of our mobile application that a mechanic or professional in the maintenance can utilize this, so it will sync additionally with the portal itself. Again, we're capturing DTC codes that are driven off the engine bus as well, so that you can be proactive in getting your maintenance completed and driving safe out there.
And I just would like to add really quick too, the DOT is certainly one of our concerns, but it's not our only concern. We have litigation involved in an accident. As many of you may know, your truck, if it's past a 1999, is recording everything your driver does. When he's on the gas, when he's on the brake, when he pushes in the clutch. And in any major accident where there's litigation involved, they will do a download of this ECM. Now, I've seen it a couple of different ways where I'll actually go do it because there's litigation involved, or I'll get to the truck after an accident and there'll be a search warrant on the seat where the state has actually downloaded the ECM. And what they'll do is they'll match that up against your hours of service. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Thank you, Jeff. Another question: does M2M offer a camera system with maintenance? Yes, we do. We can outfit your trucks with 1 to 8 cameras, so it can be as easy or complex as you want, and the maintenance system is very robust. Next question: can our certified mechanics sign for monthly maintenance reports?
I'm not sure what you mean by certified. If you have mechanics that work for you as a motor carrier, if they're doing federal annual inspections, they need a form filled out for that. And the form's available from the FMCSA, or you can email me and I'll send you a copy. If you have any mechanics that are doing any work on your trucks for the motor carrier, they need to have the brake inspector filled out. And again, they don't need to be certified through a state program or some type of industry program. There is an exemption if they've been doing it for 1 year or longer in a shop. So there are ways that your guys can have that, but they absolutely need that if they're working on the trucks themselves.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. Another question came in. Does the pre-trip inspection have to be done at the start of the day or within the 24 hours any time of the day?
Before the truck is moved at the beginning of the shift.
That was clear and cut. Okay. We still got about 15 minutes if anyone else wants to put some questions out there. Anything at all? Hold on. Oh, hold on. One came in. This is more of a technical question. Every time I log in at the beginning of my day, the tablet asks me if I want to do a DVIR. The DVIR is only for the end of the day, right? That is correct. So in the system itself, we're not distinguishing. We call it a DVIR. It can be either a pre or post inspection. So we're just trying to urge people to do their pre-trip beforehand. So if you want to shoot us an email at support@m2minmotion.com with any suggestions, we'd be more than happy to look at it. Jeff's got one more.
Yeah, so something to remember on a compliance review when they ask proof for repairs. So say your truck is stopped at a scale and you have a marker light out. Now, it's not an out of service, so he doesn't get that fixed for 2 days, right? So the repair receipt has that second day's date on it. Well, he has to have that DVIR listing that light out up until we have that proof of repairs. So it's one of the things to keep in mind if it's, and it's why they ask for proof of repairs. So in other words, as long as that condition exists, it has to be listed on the DVIR. And again, the DVIR is done at the end of the shift.
One more question came in. Is carrier required to obtain fuel and toll receipts under ELD system?
Yes, you're required to take those. Now, there is some direction from the FMCSA that if you're running an ELD and it's a compliant ELD, that the safety investigator can not ask for those. He has that discretion, but you as the motor carrier are still required to have these documents.
Another one, split sleeper rule. Any chance of making it more flexible in the future?
They're undergoing a test right now to make it more flexible. I think it's one of the changes we will see. The problem right now with the split sleeper berth is it's so complex that we're seeing drivers cited for using it correctly, and we're seeing drivers not use it correctly. The split sleeper berth exemption is a good tool, but the rules now make it almost impossible to use correctly, and even worse for the people, for your company to monitor. Oh, and one of the questions they will ask when they do a review during the interview stage, they will ask you, how do you check your hours of service for falsifications? That's a question you will be asked.
Thank you, Jeff. Another question. A driver told me that at a previous company, they were just marking fuel on their logs. It should be logged as on duty on their logs, correct?
Correct. You can't, if you're fueling, it's clearly on duty, not driving. What we see in reviews are a guy taking his 30-minute break at the same exact time he's fueling, but he shows no on duty time for fueling, just the 30-minute break. This will get caught every time.
Good question. All right, we still have a little bit of time here, folks. Okay, here comes another one. Taking pictures of the BOL for every load and adding them to the DOC option is required?
What's the DOC option?
To the DOC document option. So they're within the mobile application, there's a document storage app.
Yeah, what's required is that they put down the commodity or the bill of lading number. There's no requirement for the actual bill of lading. In fact, there might be some really good reasons for not doing that, for just putting in the number. But you are required to put in the number or the commodity onto the hours of service record.
That should be good. Okay. Thank you. All right. Any more questions? We've got about 10 minutes still remaining. If anyone wants to ask anything, please feel free.
While we're waiting for something to come in, I can just tell you one of the most effective ways to keep up on this and also to increase your driver retention is to meet with your drivers every once in a while, have a safety meeting. Besides you getting them some information that they might need to know, it's a good way to find out what the drivers are doing. They might, when they all get together in a room as a safety meeting, you'd be surprised when they'll let you know that you might not know. So it's a good way of going, and we find that companies that do these type of meetings also have better driver retention. We also understand that it's almost impossible for some companies to get their drivers all together because they live in different states and just their work schedules. Putting together a small newsletter and sending it out electronically to your drivers is a huge way to keep in contact with your drivers, and it kind of lets them know that you care about what they're doing too. So just any kind of newsletter you can do, send it out quarterly. These are the little things you can do that help with retention and overall help you.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that, then we got one more question. And actually something that we at M2M have been working on is somewhat of a communications hub, so that you'll be able to improve the life of your drivers by giving them education, a place for them to have rewards, contests, etc. So I think that's a great idea. Another question that just came out: what kind of maintenance schedule should you, as a carrier that only has owner-operators?
If you only have owner-operators, basically, if they're taking care of their truck, it can be anything that they want it to be, but you have to have something written. The FMCSA actually has a suggested schedule, but it can be anything. In other words, next oil change, 10,000 miles. Next oil change, 500,000 miles. You just need something in writing that says when the next PM is due. Now, what we've seen for companies that have the lowest maintenance score is to ask for monthly maintenance reports from their owner-operators. In other words, once a month, the owner-operator has to send in a form and list any repairs that they made on the truck. And this is really huge. Also, their tire tread depth rating measurements, right? Not that we really going to put a lot into this, but it shows that we have a solid maintenance program. So besides the DOT, if one of our guys are in an accident, we have a pretty good defense that, look, we're a good, safe carrier. We're doing everything we can to make sure we're a safe carrier. So again, the most successful companies and the companies with the lowest vehicle maintenance scores just require a monthly maintenance report from their owner-operators.
Great question, Obi. I got another good question here. In regards to data retention, is it mandatory to keep data of drivers that have been terminated? Are we required to turn over all GPS data from M2M?
Yes. Typically, when you're asked for the driver files, they will ask you first for a list of all the drivers that worked for you for the last 365 days, and the hire date and the termination date for those drivers. Now, we have this happen a lot where we do the driver list, we submit it to the FMCSA, and then we have a roadside inspection with a driver that wasn't on the list. Now we've tendered a false document knowingly or unknowingly. But the regulation is quite clear that even if the driver leaves you, if he worked for you within the last 365 days, his driver qualification file is absolutely auditable. But now they can only go through his logs from 6 months from the date they come in. So in other words, if they came in today, they can go back exactly 6 months and ask for any logs, even if that driver had left.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, we got a few more minutes here, people. If we have any more questions, it'd be a good time to type them out. Give it a few more here. And just to reiterate, we're going to be doing another webinar at the end of May, which is going to be about transitioning from AOBRD to ELD, and then another in-person, which we will get you guys all the details about the venue, time and date, which will be about, again, transitioning from AOBRD to ELD, as well as a pretty big reveal about the new platform that we think you guys are all going to love.
Yeah, just kind of expand on that last question. During a compliance review, it's not unusual at all for the safety investigator to call the log provider, or the maintenance shop, or the shipper, or the receiver, or just about anything connected to the hours of service. So they absolutely have that right.
Yeah, I think that, and we just had another question. Are we also required to turn over data if drivers no longer with the company? And what are the legal implications? So you answered the first part. What are the legal implications, if any? They don't.
Well, if you have missing documents, those are scored as missing documents. In other words, if they ask for the driver qualification file for a driver that worked for you in the last 365 days, and you don't produce it, those are missing documents. So you can, of course, be fined for that. depending on how many you're missing, that can affect your safety rating. If that driver was involved in an accident and you didn't have any of the qualification files, this would be very, very costly to your company. So legal jeopardy, you would be cited for not having documents you're required to retain. But your biggest fear would be is if that driver was in an accident and they're requesting documents you don't have. Having said that, most states you have 2 years to file. So it's not unusual for you to find out an accident that you knew nothing about that happened 1 year and 11 months ago.
Good point. Okay. Anything else?
Just one more quick thing.
Jeff wants to touch on one more point.
Yeah, it just reminded me why we're talking about accidents. All your drivers should know what to do in case of an accident. One of the worst things that can happen is your driver starting to talk to people about the accident. You should tell all your drivers after an accident the only person they should talk to is you, and the only person you should talk to is your attorney or your insurance company. A lot of times, things are made much worse by people talking to people they don't know who they are or what they're doing.
Got a really good question here. How should we record file rogue drivers that are logging out of ELD devices and keep driving? Is a disciplinary letter sufficient? What should we do in addition?
If you're catching the driver with a falsified log, it has to match whatever your hours of service policy is. It's not unusual in a compliance review for a carrier to tender a hours of service policy says we're going to fine the driver for this infraction, and then the safety investigator asks for a settlement or something to show that that deduction was made or that sanction was taken against the driver, and we can't produce it. It's even worse in civil litigation to have a policy you don't enforce. So while there's certainly nothing wrong with that, it should be a progressive disciplinary policy. In other words, you're not going to fire the guy the first time he does a false log, but maybe by the third time, it's time to think, is this guy running a risk to you and your company? And maybe it's time that we part ways. But you need a policy, and whatever policy you have, you need to make sure you enforce it to everyone exactly the same.
Very good point. Okay. All right, we have about 3 minutes left. Are there any more questions that you would like to ask?
Just really quick, and again, I really appreciate M2M for asking us to help out with this, but the time to prepare for an audit is now, not after you get the letter. It's going to cost you a lot less money and also be a lot easier to correct any issues.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. Here we got one more question that just came in. When we log on duty not driving to get fuel, do we have to input our fuel UPS info into the system, fuel ups?
No.
No, you do not. Anything else? Okay. Obviously, if there's any additional questions, you can always reach out to us at M2M in Motion. We certainly appreciate everyone's time today. We're really trying hard to make it easier on you as an organization so you guys can keep trucking, out there pulling loads. We will be putting out some more information again about the additional webinars that we're going to be putting on. We have one last question. Coyote wants to integrate with our system. Should we do it? Send an email to support@m2minmotion.com on that one. If I assume they're talking about MacroPoint integration, which we've already completed. All we need to do is provide an API key. So just send that email request to support. But again, we're at 2:30. We really appreciate everyone's business. We're working very hard to make sure that you all have a great solution out there. And we look forward to serving you. I'd like to thank again Jeff Clark from CPSE, He did a fantastic job. We're building a very good relationship here, and hopefully it will be beneficial to everyone involved. So, again, thank you for your time, and you guys have a great afternoon.